Speaking as a lawyer, I must say I found there are still one or two of us left. I must say I found reading this bill I felt quite queasy reading this legislation. It's not the kind of thing that I would expect this Parliament to be considering, and I've detected the same level of queasiness in some of the other lawyers who've spoken from the government benches, the former Justice Secretary, the current chair of the Justice Select Committee also apparently found it a queasy experience reading the legislation. I agree with the former Tory law officer Lord Garnier, who used to be in this House, who called this bill political nonsense and legal nonsense. It designates Rwanda as a safe country, but by doing so, it's seeking to reverse a conclusion of the Supreme Court on the facts. Now, it's perfectly reasonable if the Supreme Court strikes down a policy to legislate, but one normally legislates to change a policy, not to try and purport to change the facts or say that the facts which have not changed are other than what the court found them to be. That was the first thing that made me feel queasy. It goes on to try and prohibit any legal challenges that may come forward to argue that Rwanda, having been deemed safe in this way, is in fact unsafe. It says that every decision maker considering this must conclusively treat the Republic of Rwanda as a safe country, notwithstanding any evidence that might come forward to the contrary. And given that the evidence that has already come forward and has been dealt with by the Supreme Court in that judgment led them to say unanimously that it was not safe, it's quite worrying, I think, that we simply seem to think we can legislate to change the facts. It allows a very narrow range of claims, and this comes to the heart of the argument between those on the government benches who wish to beef it up even further to exclude any kind of legal change, and those in perhaps the One Nation side of the Conservative Party that are trying to put a line in the sand to say they won't accept any further amendments. It does allow a very narrow range of claims, but based only on compelling evidence relating specifically to the person's individual circumstances. And even those sorts of claims are excluded in some circumstances, those that relate to refoulement. So excluding courts by Act of Parliament from considering relevant evidence, excluding them from taking accounts of judgments and laws, including domestic legislation, and fettering their judgment as the bill seeks to do, giving ministers power to ignore injunctions taken together, it's tantamount to undermining the rule of law. It's certainly not respecting the rule of law, as I would expect parliamentarians in this place to do, and as I would expect the government of the day to seek to do if it were to wish to uphold our international reputation. I think it beggars belief that the government's response to its loss in the Supreme Court of its policy is to ask this House to legislate to just declare that it's all fine anyway and let's carry on. And even, as others have pointed out, if we were to start sending asylum seekers to Rwanda as a result of this bill passing into law, it's designed for a few hundred people at most, less than 1% of the people arriving in the UK. And the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office has been very clear when he said there's no evidence it's going to work as a deterrent, whereas most of what we hear from members opposite is that that is the very purpose of the legislation, that it's supposed to be a deterrent. So there we have it. It's actually a shibboleth, a Tory shibboleth, an article of faith it's become for some of the elements of the Tory party, the five families, I think they've called themselves somewhat menacingly. And as we see this Tory psychodrama unfolding yet again today, in order to try and decide the fate of the latest unelected Tory Prime Minister, to be threatened with defenestration by some of the more right-wing elements of the five families. The country deserves better, and as my right honourable friend from the Labour front bench set out in her excellent speech, time and again they're going for gimmicks and infighting over basic competence and good administration. It's 4 years since the Tories promised to end boat crossings in 6 months. Almost a year after the current PM promised again to stop the boats, 30,000 more people have arrived. Hotel use is going up, not down, as the Home Secretary claimed. It's at 56,000 at the moment, 10,000 more than when the Prime Minister promised to end hotel use. Criminal gangs are not being deterred. Convictions for people smugglers have dropped by 36% since 2010, and the criminal gangs are making far more money now than they ever were. The backlog of undetermined cases remains at 165,000, despite the PM's promise to abolish the backlog of initial asylum claims by the end of this year. It's folly to continue with this farcical failed joke of a policy when what's really needed is competent, good administration. Why not put the money being wasted on this policy into dealing with the actual problem? If the party opposite and the government were to actually try and do that rather more successfully than they've managed in the last 13 years, they might get some credit from this side of the House and from the nation. But there's precious little evidence that there's going to be any of that.
Mr. Deputy